Hey, everybody. We are back with another podcast. This is Jon Arnold and my longtime colleague, Chris Fine. Hi, Chris.
Hi, Jon. Good to be here again.
Yeah, and we are off and running in 2019 now, and we've been both quite busy lately, and we are definitely due for another podcast, and we thank everybody who's been listening to our podcast. I think you're going to hear more about them as the year goes on, as we find more ways to share what we're talking about with a broader audience. So look for that, and we thank you for your continued support. So here we are. 2019 has already been very busy on many fronts. So Chris, you and I have been doing our share of conferences, and this might be a little bit of a roundup, but I think there are some common threads here. So I think we should start off with you. We have talked a lot about workplace kind of impact with digital transformation, and that's hitting things on a lot of levels, and there's still lots of ground to explore. So let's get into something that you've been at recently, this WX Summit. And I think for the listeners, this will all start to make sense as we go into some of the things we've been seeing lately. So you are definitely getting closer to that world of office space evolution, decisions about real estate, office planning, workflow design. This is really getting pretty interesting, and I think the intersections are coming fast with this and the kind of technologies that I certainly see a lot of in the collaboration space, huh?
I agree, Jon, and thanks. The WX Summit was held last month in Park City in Utah. It was nice. There was a lot of snow, and it was interesting. It was sponsored by a company called Teem, Teem, who's based in Salt Lake City, and Teem was founded as a technology company a few years ago to help book conference rooms and manage shared space in the office. So they were one of the first companies to have the little screens outside conference rooms, little iPads that would show you whether they were busy or not. You could do dynamic booking of the space. And they also had, and I think this is actually where they started, larger screens that might be out in the lobby or the reception area or the elevator area that would show where the conference rooms were and what might be going on, subject to confidentiality. Were they busy or not? And Teem got together with HPE Aruba a while ago to incorporate interior location sensing using Aruba's Meridian product, which uses Bluetooth and Wi-Fi together to let you very closely map where assets or people are and give people directions and stuff like that. So the two companies working together produced a pretty good solution for managing conference room space and the user interface around that. And Teem was recently bought by WeWork, which is the giant company that started in co-working, but now plans to expand pretty far beyond that. And so this was a really interesting conference, about a 1-day, 2-day thing with maybe 150 people, 100, 200 people from all disciplines of workplace and real estate. And it was everybody from real estate management types to some investors to smaller technology companies to large technology companies to end users. And it was very end user oriented. So you had a bunch of speakers from either IT or corporate real estate at end user companies. And so the main takeaway is just that this trend toward less fixed space is just accelerating. And it's not only just the layout of the space, but also is a space taken on a traditional lease, or is it just flexed in and flexed out when it's needed for a project or whatever? So, Jon, I think that ties into a lot of the technologies we've talked about and where, for example, you see in collaboration is going, because you can imagine that many of the assumptions we made about where people work and when they work and how they work are all changing.
Yeah. So do you see this being more about businesses, organizations trying to reduce their footprint with real estate, or are they still trying to figure out the best way to, design their office spaces that encourage people to collaborate and be more comfortable?
It's both. It's both.
Hmm.
Real estate tends to tie up a lot of capital on the balance sheet of companies because, and some of the rules have tightened about that recently, at least in the US, about how you account for leases. And so there's an incentive to treat it more like an expense, which you can do if it's sort of a more of a month to month thing and you can be more flexible. Also, the utilization statistics on most office space are not too encouraging given the cost of the space because it tends to hover around 70% of what you rented. And also there are types of space like conference rooms that are very often very inefficiently used, which usually leads to unnecessary underutilized space. So there is definitely some cost cutting and accounting stuff, but it's also very much about productivity. And the initiative to change is very often led by chief digital transformation officer, chief innovation officer, coupled potentially with corporate real estate. So it's not just a cost saving measure. It's both.
Yeah, yeah. In an offhand way, this reminds me of the competition that we used to have back in the 50s and 60s between watching TV and going out to the movies, right? They were trying to one up each other as TV started to get more mind share and audience share. That the TV, when color TV came in, it got more intriguing, and then movies had to respond by going to, widescreen and Panavision and 3D and drive-ins to make the experience better, right? And so now we're getting back to home theaters and, there's a lot of competition for our attention. And I think similar things are happening in the workplace in that the remote trend is really strong. And there's a, culture growing up now where people almost expect to be working from home and prefer to work from home because commuting is so intolerable. Yet we don't know how productive people really are when they're not in the office. And so what I'm seeing too is some of this technology that I'll talk about in a minute to what you're saying, like with a chief digital officer, chief experience officer, the office space, I think, has to be, in a sense, competing with the comforts of home. That, I think there's a fundamental belief that people are more productive when they work together in person. So how do you make that office environment more conducive to saying it's a better experience here than working from home? Not because we want you to be a slave at your desk, but we want you to experience all the wonderful things we have here that make your workday more productive. And that includes things like the spaces, the furniture, the ambient environment, those kind of things. That's before I get into the technology stuff. That's kind of, I'm seeing a little bit of parallel there in terms of, you are competing for kind of what Cisco talked about last week, and I'll get to that in a minute, the hearts and minds of your audience.
Well, I agree, John, on several fronts there. You said some very perceptive observations. I'm not sure it's so much home versus office. It's just anywhere versus office. People want to work wherever they want to work from. Some people it's home. Some people it's not. There are a lot of people who don't like to work at home. They don't have a good home environment. They don't, they feel lonely. They feel disconnected. So, and then there are other people who love working at home, don't have any problem with it. And then there's all a spectrum in between. But what the workplace, broadly speaking, probably needs to do is to provide some kind of continuum and connected environment where it's kind of transparent what you're doing, and you adapt where you are and what you're doing to the task at hand and to your own preferences to be more productive and collaborate. But the other thing that you said that was right on the money from anything I've seen is that most places where people are or move through now are more and more experiential oriented, and much of the technology that people use all the time is very experiential. Home automation, smartphones, and experience is kind of the watchword that everybody's pushing in every environment. So it doesn't work well when you have, especially younger people who've grown up with experiential technology from the get-go, who then go into an office and it's like an ancient mausoleum, for lack of a better word, or not convenient or not well positioned to work together and collaborate. And so there's a natural incentive to make this more of a continuum across different kinds of spaces.
Yeah. Yeah. We could go on this tangent a long time, and we're not even talking about technology yet, right? This brings a lot of worlds together, and I'm glad we're talking about it because, it's very easy to be siloed and just think about, oh, well, what video conferencing technology should we go with? And where there really is I think a bigger story here to really consider.
I think if you're in any of the sectors of people who might listen to this podcast, you need to think about this.
Yeah.
Because it's going to affect this trend in the way people work and where they work and how the workplace is laid out. And, the arrangement by which companies retain and rent workspace and all of this is in a very fluid state right now. A lot of opportunity, but you have to think about it. Why don't we get on to your two conferences, Jon? Just flow into what you've been doing.
Okay, yeah. So I have been to 3 events actually over the last little while, and we're not going to cover them all. But I do want to speak in particular to Cisco's analyst event that was in San Jose recently, and it was specifically just for analysts, and it was kind of an update on their collaboration business. They'll speak in more detail at Enterprise Connect about the really cool things they're doing, so a lot of it's not for public consumption yet. But I will cite a few examples that I think really support what you've been saying here, Chris, and that is the way that they're looking at technology now for collaboration. As you say, it's become very experiential, and there's a big push, of course, with AI to make everything more intuitive, more automated, but also, with some degree of intelligence that you can actually trust it to do things for you. And so the idea about meeting spaces seems to be what most of the vendors are glomming on. It's a bit of that low-hanging fruit thing where there's a lot of, data that talks about how meeting spaces are underutilized, not properly supported with the right technology. So a lot of vendors are going into this direction. Even, Amazon with their Alexa for Business is focused primarily on making the meeting experience better. I saw some very interesting things from what Cisco is doing there. And it really is tying these worlds together with applications that are intelligent, yes, but also very much voice driven to make them feel more natural and interactive. So all the vendors are moving to some kind of capability where you have voice activated commands to start a meeting, to dim the lights, to basically notify the attendees. And now we're starting to see things like real-time transcription, so you don't have to take notes in the meeting. But for the meeting spaces themselves, I just want to bring an example in that shows how with facial recognition, the cameras inside a meeting room can identify everybody by face. So if you are watching remotely what's going on in the meeting room, the screen will actually show not just the faces of the people, which you see, but also underneath they'll be superimposed with their names and titles. And the more advanced applications will allow you to have instant links to public profile information about them. So you don't have to be guessing while you're in a meeting who a person is or what their roles are. So that can help make meetings a little more interactive and participative that way. And another thing that's more about to where you're going with the managing of the space is the idea that you can have enough intelligence now in these platforms that they can detect how full the room is to its comfort level. So if you have, 12 people in a room that's really only built for 7 people kind of thing, the collaboration platform will recognize that and could have enough intelligence and access to the rest of what the organization has to say, hey, there is a room on the 3rd floor, for example, that is bigger and might accommodate your group more comfortably. Would you like to move the meeting to that space now? And if you just said yes, everything that's gone on in that room, it can automatically flow, where that's a workflow thing, right? Where it would reserve the space, activate controls, transfer the information that's going on there, and seamlessly make that meeting, move from one room to another. You just get up and go, and just continue where you left off. And anyone who's following remotely will also be along for the ride. So I think there are some not possible, but there's some value here to make that experience more conducive, a better balance for what's going on, and can be dynamic. It will adjust in real time. And bigger picture for that IT person or maybe the chief digital officer, it will give them some metrics to show how effectively various spaces are being deployed, right? And you start building trend data around that, you can get a sense for what your needs are as you grow, right? When you say you maybe are going to be moving to a new space, you have data now that tells you, how often people meet, how large those meetings are, how long they run, what tools they're using in those meetings. So now you've got some intelligence that gives you some good direction about how that space needs to be constructed, right, to get the most use. Because as we said earlier, we are competing in a way against remote working, mobile working, home working as an environment that is comfortable for people. Because if you're constantly in meetings that are bad experiences, you'll turn around and roll your eyes and say, well, is it any wonder why I'd rather work from home? And of course, the organization wants it to be the exact opposite if they want productivity to really get better.
Absolutely. And I would add, it's not only just competing with home, it's competing with every other company that's looking for talent. So,
yeah.
We didn't really mention it earlier. I probably should have thrown it in, but there's a big HR element to all of this. And so if you look at the fully loaded cost of people and attracting and retaining people, that's a significant number. And so that gives you a significant budget to work against in terms of ROI if you can solve some of these problems. And the example you cited is also a great example, because the example of this room is too full. That's a great example of a real use case, a real thing that is it's on one element, it looks really simple from a requirement standpoint. If room is too complicated, or if room is too full, find another room that is better. But when you look under the covers of that incorporates several technologies that until very recently just haven't worked well at all and are making very rapid strides. Things like the image recognition, the pattern recognition, the people counting, the algorithmic decision making about what a better room is based on a lot of parameters. That was something that people have been wanting to do for a long time, but just only recently have enough different technologies converged to make that little thing that means a big change in productivity and making things work better possible. And there's a bunch of different examples that are like that are rapidly coming around the horizon.
Okay. Yeah, we've got some really good tangents here to keep on with, Chris, but we kind of are up on time, so we want to make sure we keep it short and sweet, but we do have lots more to talk about. I certainly have other conferences that I've been at that are worth recapping a bit, and you also are seeing lots of interesting things in the events you're attending, and of course coming up there's new ones. So we have no shortage of things to talk about. So on that note, let us give it a stop for today, but we will be back with our next podcast. So Chris, I want to give you another big thank you for taking time with me today, and we're keeping it going here. So any just last comments here from you?
John, thank you, and thanks everybody for listening. And I think this is a whole bunch of things we can continue on further. And I think in our world, that's what we should be doing, because it's a big area.
Yeah, agreed. Okay, so we'll sign off now, and thanks everyone for listening. And we will be back with another podcast next edition.